goes. All righty. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And we return to the subject of Mexico. It's another one of our all things Mexico edition, all things Latin America edition. And we welcome back on the program Gabriel Martinez, who is from Mexico, has lived most of his life in Mexico City. He holds an MA in critical and cultural theory from the University of Leeds, England, and is currently studying a PhD in Latin American Studies at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Before starting his PhD, Gabriel was a collaborator at Orinoco Tribune, and of course, we've had many times as frequent champions Saheli, Chowdhury, and Jesus Rodriguez, the editors of Orinoco Tribune, the program. And we're going to be discussing U.S.-Mexico relations, the legacy of AMLO, the Mexican center-left president who is now stepping down, and the efforts to undermine him, the new president-elect who is from AMLO's party, Morena Claudia Sheinbaum, and no doubts we'll be talking a lot more and what to expect with her and so much more. But first, Gabriel, thank you so much for coming back on the program, and it's been a long time coming, so and thanks for taking the time on Saturday morning to come on 1+1, so I really appreciate that.
No, thank you very much, Yuri. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Likewise, and before we talk about U.S.-Mexico relations and that very long history, I did want to ask you this question, which is briefly describe how Mexico was before Spanish colonization with the Aztec civilizations, and what were some of the half-truths and full-on fake news regarding the Aztecs that still persist when we talk about when we talk about the Spanish colonization of Mexico, and what of Spanish colonization's legacy sadly still persists in Mexico?
Wow, that's a hefty question.
Yeah.
No, I mean it's interesting. I guess because this is something which I guess we can focus it from a point of view of yes, there's many things which have not really been are not known really about the process, right? One of the, I guess, where we can start maybe is one of the myths that were brought about by the colonization of the Americas, of the Caribbean first, and then Mexico by 1521, is the idea, one of these, myths of Western colonization, of European colonization in the Americas, has to do with the idea that there were no, when the colonizers came, there was very little population. There wasn't really, these were, barren lands. These were lands which were uninhabited.
Yeah.
This is, well, if we look at what's going on right now in Palestine, it's kind of the same idea. The idea that Palestinians were desert Bedouins just before Israel created a nation. So it's kind of that same logic. Because, and I think this is something from a, like a theoretical, philosophical point of view of, the philosophy of liberation, which is the Latin American current of philosophy, of understanding that there's a certain pattern in the forms of modernity, of forms of how modernity formed itself through colonization. And one of these ideas, which began with the discovery of the Americas, was the idea that that the Americas was in a certain way a construction of what was projected by Europe onto the Americas. And the first idea was that these places were really uninhabited. These places had no civilization. that civilization was brought to the Americas by the first wave of colonizers, which were the Spanish and the Portuguese, and a century after that, the English, the Dutch, and the French. So there's sort of many there's many things which are not really discussed about how that period was how the Americas were before the the conquest or the colonization. I mean, if we look at it from a philosophical point of view, there's this idea Hegel puts forth in his philosophy of history, like consciousness comes from the West, comes from Europe, and it is when consciousness looks upon the Americas that there is that the spirit bursts forth in the Americas, like the newest place. But this, of course, is kind of part of those myths of trying to create the idea that there was nothing here, that there were no people here, that there was just savages, and that there was no civilizations, that there was but I mean, we of course know that this is all myth. People had there was languages, there was written forms of writing. Like ideographically, and there was many things, there was, many cultures, and there was a whole historic process of different groups of migrations of ethnic groups, which had um, created civilizations which had already decayed, and other civilizations which were mm, kind of bursting forth, and everything. So yeah, I mean, there's that idea that civilization came with a European, which is kind of like something which has now become a cliche of the discussion about Latin America, and there's also something which strangely enough, which is also kind of a myth about modernity, is the idea that modernity begins with the Enlightenment and begins in the 17th and 18th century with Northern Europe. But what's important also to understand is that actually modernity begins like a century before that, and begins exactly with the conquest of the Americas, with the fact that Europe before uh, before that was kind of like the periphery of Asia. Asia was the center. China, India. This was the cultural, the economic center of the world system of that time. And Europe was always trying to compete. I mean, the Crusades were this. The Crusades were a form, like a form of trying to enter into the areas of influence, of economic and cultural and political influence. And Europe could never do that until it discovered the Americas. And by doing this, it was able to come into a territory which was bigger than Europe. The Americas, is a much larger territory. It was discovering a whole, like gaining these territories, but also gaining, in a very basic terms, bullion, silver and gold, which was able to, and that allowed Europe to be able to gain what Marx calls primary or primitive accumulation, which allowed financial forms of capital accumulation, of money. And this allowed Europe to be able to finally have something to trade with Asia, trade for silk, for tea, and for all these things which Asia had. And this is something kind of very central to the understanding of, from philosophy of liberation, from dependency theory, from world system theories, from all this thinking about how the capitalist world came about. But the role of the Americas in the creation of Europe, of the Western world, as the dominant hegemonic form of the past 5 to 3 centuries, has to do with the discovery of the Americas and what was there, and how the myths were created in regards to what wasn't there or was there before they came.
I have to ask them this follow-up question. I actually, I have to ask this follow-up question, which is, So now, so the Aztecs, like they had like geometry, they had like a written language, they had uh, their own version of civilization with, I guess you could say, Aztec characteristics, Mexican characteristics. But is one of the but talk about uh, the religious fundamentalism of the Aztecs, particularly when it came to human sacrifice and so forth like that, because a Mexican American friend of mine who's part of the collective Anti-Conquista, she was saying to me that yes, the Aztecs did participate in that, but that it was grossly exaggerated by by Spanish writers, by Spanish colonialists to justify the savage colonization, the colonial project that Spain pursued in Mexico. So I'm curious if you could talk a bit about that.
Yes. Yes. I mean, the person is telling you is correct. I mean, uh, I'm not really an expert on Hispanic cultures. The I mean, for example, the Mayas had developed kind of like advanced mathematical knowledges. The Mayas had already the concept of zero, of nothingness, of zero, even for like the Europeans, or this is something which came from like Indo-Arabic numbers, no, right? This is something which didn't come from the Western culture. It's something which there were, yes, and they had some astronomical insights, especially the Mayas, also the Aztecs, but more the Mayas had kind of well-developed astronomical knowledge. And yes, we had civilizations, which were able to write ideographically, had forms of writing. Highly developed in their organizational forms and structures. And there was, I mean, as I was saying previously, there were civilizations which had developed uh, in a in different forms, but highly developed when the Spanish came. Yes, there were human sacrifices among the Aztecs, among the Mayas too, I think, and these were religious forms which predominated this in the societies, and they were taken as justifications for a Christianization, for trying to consider the Aztec civilization, the civilizations of Mexico, not just the Aztecs, but Zapotecs, Mixtecs, all the different groups that were in Mexico, and all the way from Taoist Mexico to more nomadic groups in the north, as considered as savages. But this was just, I mean, the main aspect for that was the idea that if they weren't Christian, then they were they should be considered as
Pagans,
subject,
heretics.
yeah, and the subjects of conquest. Uh, the thing is that yes, I mean, what the what the Europeans, the Spanish, the Iberians justified through the conquest, and it's kind of it's very interesting to kind of analyze the period, because there's there's an intellectual need to justify the subjugation of the populations, and how Spain and Portugal reasoned this idea. First, they had to reason the fact that they weren't probably human. I mean, and I'm talking about something very specific, which is a discussion that happened between Bartolomé de las Casas, which was a missionary who came to who came to the Americas, came first to Santo Domingo, to Dominic, to what's now like the Isle of the Hispaniola, the island of Hispaniola, and Sepúlveda, which was kind of a scholar in Spain, because they had to begin by discussing the humanity of the natives of the Americas, to try and rationalize the enslavement and the genocide of the local populations.
Yeah.
Sacrifices was, of course, one of the aspects which they considered and made them savages. And this is ironic if we think about how the violence that the Spanish kingdom had to assert against the caliphates, against the Muslim the Muslim occupation of the Iberian Peninsula, and how the Inquisition served as a form of, human sacrifice
Yeah.
of those subjects within the social structures which were considered as heretic, which were considered as marginal, and how hypocritical it was to denounce sacrifices, but at the same time have a whole institutionalized form of human sacrifices made by something as the Inquisition, and the persecution of Jews, and the persecution of heretics, and the persecution of the people who weren't Catholic. It's very interesting also because I was some time ago I was preparing for a lecture for a conference I gave, and this is more kind of like in the 17th century. In the 17th century, some of the elites in the UK and in other parts had this idea that you had to eat the corpses. You had to I don't know if they had to get some burnt or some sort of dried corpses, and they would eat this as a form of, because they believed this would give them health or something. And this is something which, and especially, I think it was especially like a Moroccan, you had to get it from Moroccan people or something, so they would eat the corpses of some. Please don't quote me on this. I should, but I mean, this is something which
But
is.
this, but this was the Western Europeans, like the English
Yeah.
practicing and stuff like that, which they later, I
Yes,
mean, yeah, I mean, like they
yeah,
depict like the Aztecs and the Mayans as these like bloodthirsty cannibals, and
yeah.
participate in human sacrifice. But it's like it's as when so they exploit the half truth, but really it's almost like a form of like projection.
Yes, exactly. And that is something which I think we're gonna something very recurring in the ideological construction of Western colonial hegemony is the idea of projection of we're seeing it right now in Palestine, right? This idea of we're the victims and we project over the we're the victim, like the Israelis, the Zionist entity being the victimizer, but they see themselves as the victim. And we're going to see this as the logic of colonialism all through of how this was formed. And it's really interesting because once you kind of understand imperialism and colonialism as something vital to the form of the construction of the West, of Western ethos, of Anglo-European domination, you understand that these forms of thinking come from that very beginning I was talking about, from that very discussion between Bartolomé de las Casas, which is a very interesting character actually, and Sepúlveda, these two monks in Spain discussing about the humanity of the other, the humanity of the non-European. And based on that discussion, it was determined whether they could be enslaved and killed, or if they should be respected and Christianized. Las Casas is a very interesting character in the sense that he was one of the first individuals to turn against this, to be critical of the idea of the colonial enterprise. Las Casas, San Bartolome Las Casas came to, as I was saying, came first to the Caribbean and then came to Mexico. And he would discuss, he saw that this was going to be a genocide. He saw like, if we keep going like this, like what we're doing, enslaving people and driving them into the mines and, and exploiting them, they're going to disappear. So at the beginning, he as an expedient, he was for bringing African slaves. And this has been very criticized about him. And I think like in his defense, this was something which he later on he was he was I mean he was not happy with what he had said. I mean, this doesn't mean that slaves were brought because of him. You know, like slaves were being brought before he thought that it was a good expedient. After all, he regretted having saying this. He said this was incorrect, that he should never have said that, and because he was all
and he preferred more to I mean, he preferred more of a forced assimilation amongst the population as opposed to just stealing the land, genociding people, and then, well, we need people to work, so then
yeah
we kidnap the African slaves and so forth. So he preferred more of of a forced assimilation, which has happened with, when we talk about Spanish speaking Americas
yeah
and Portugal. Yeah, when we talk about like Latin America and Brazil, that's more or less what happened, right?
yeah. Well, actually, it's he was against the conquest. He became more and more convinced that the Europeans were doing, what the Europeans were doing in the Americas was illegal from a point of view of the rights of the natural rights of human beings, to the point of saying, okay, so if we came here to Christianize, because that was the justification to civilize and to Christian, to Christian, I don't know if that's the term in English, sorry, to Christianize the natives, we've done that. We can go now. This is over. Stop playing the game. And it has a very interesting, he has many texts, but he has a very interesting text where he denounces that this is a fallacy, that this whole enterprise is not about Christianizing, or is not about saving or civilizing. It's about exploiting. Lascaux is a very interesting character. You could say he's like one of the first philosophical critic. I mean, one of the first, critical theorists of modernity. He's already saying this whole thing is a lie, is a fraud. All you're doing this is to get gold. All you're doing this is to get land. All you're doing is fooling us, fooling yourselves, and fooling everyone, and killing. So no, I mean, I would think that Las Casas is a good place to try to begin to form an idea of what we could call like an anti-colonial, a decolonial philosophy. And it's interesting because if we take it from, for example, from philosopher Dussel, Enrique Dussel, a Mexican Argentinian philosopher, this is a moment, like it is the connection with the other, which is the non-European, the otherness. In that moment, there's an understanding of the self. I'm talking a little bit on philosophical terms, as with the relation to the other. There's like a consciousness of a European consciousness of itself as Europe, as the West, and West is a tricky term, but we can go into that if you like. But I mean, it's kind of complex. That needed to identify itself as a conqueror to identify its idea of itself, right? I think I'm kind of complicating things, but I mean, Las Casas is interesting in that sense, to try and understand how thinking, like theoretical, ethical, political thinking developed in Europe, and it developed through its material history of conquest. I mean, this idea that philosophy came from the Greeks and then, is this noble enterprise. No, I mean, philosophy is something which reflects the material conditions, and that material condition was a colonial and imperialist condition, and that is, embedded in this idea of the self, the Western self, the self of the West as Dussel calls it, an ego conquero, a conquesting self. But yeah, I mean, that's a little more complex. We won't get into that.
But then, but that leads to then my questions, to this other question. So I think if we say what's Spanish colonization's legacy that still persists in Mexico, it's definitely between a small band of elites that control most of the wealth, and most of the people are being heavily exploited. Correct?
Yes.
And then that's a perfect segue into this question, which is now well, sometime last year, unfortunately, a hero of mine, John Pilger, passed away. And I know you've seen, and he did 3 documentaries on Latin America: The Mexicans, Nicaragua, A Nation's Right to Survive, and The War on Democracy. With respect to your country, let's talk a little bit about, about his documentary and which he did back in the 1980s. He was still a reporter for the Daily Mirror. Now, how bad has Mexico's chronic woes gotten when we talk about the situation of chronic poverty, political repression, and the constant fleeing for a better life in the U.S. illegally? Has that situation gotten worse or improved since Pilger made his documentary about, about your country, Mexico?
Right. Yes. Yeah. No. And just to follow up a little bit on your previous question about the elites. I mean, the formation is elites. Yes, this is something which we're probably going to come back to. But I think it's interesting what you mentioned about the formation of the elites. And this is something which will recur. The colonial system that the Spanish set in like structured in Mexico, um, created social structures, caste structures that would not necessarily have disappeared after the independence, but which would be the structures, the social structures of class antagonisms that would reverberate and which you continue throughout throughout the later period of Mexico's history. And we're going to see this reflected. We're obviously at some point going to go back to this, but yeah, going to the question about John Pilger. Yeah, I mean, you had mentioned to me this documentary, like I think like a year or something ago when we were discussing like last time with the
Yeah,
Orinoco
yeah.
Tribune, and we were
When you
kind of
first came on the, when you first came with Jesus and Saheli of Orinoco
yes,
Tribune,
yes, yes.
this one, yeah.
And I didn't know about this documentary. It's very interesting. And I also you had Jay Watts on a previous
Yes.
show, right? And you asked him about this. And I was thinking a lot about this. And I agree with what Jay. I don't know Jay, but what Jay said in that interview. But this, I mean, I think it's very interesting to place the historical context, which Jay mentioned during that show, and but there's something which I think that wasn't mentioned, which is specific about what is being featured in this documentary, and which I think is it's kind of very I think symbolic. I would consider it very symbolic. The documentary was aired in 1983, I believe, right? Because it
Yes.
says like 1983. So it was filmed in 1982, right? It was filmed during the 1982. And for me, it's this like I even wrote it down here because I think at the beginning, his introduction, Pilger writes, a country traumatized by its past and reaching its second high noon, right? He's kind of explaining the mood in 1982 in Mexico, right?
Yeah.
And then he says something, an opportunity that only comes once in history. Oil, said the president Lopez Portillo. So he's kind of setting the mood to something which was, to me, it's very interesting because what he's describing here was kind of a sort of the mood of the time, to put it in some way, uh, of what was felt at that moment. I don't exactly know when in 1982 this was filmed, but the irony of this is that that very mood that Pilger is kind of describing, and he even says these are the generalizations that only a journalist can make, right? So it's sort of trying to set like this kind of a dramatic stage about things. But the ironic thing is that what happens that very year, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know if Jay mentioned this, but what happens that August of that year, of 1982, which is Mexico's biggest economic crash until that point, and probably one of the biggest crashes in Latin America. And how that mood of this second zenith,
Yeah.
how this idea of how we were going, Mexico, because like my dad always tells me, back then, Lopez Portillo always, I don't know, this, I can't, my dad says this, but I don't know if this is true or not. He said that the president back then would say, Mexicans better get used to opulence, because from now on, I mean, this is going to be, this is going to be a bonanza and everything. But what happens in August 1982 is that Mexico, like the finance secretary then, Jesus Silva Herzog, comes out and says, I'm sorry, but Mexico has entered default, Mexico is unable to pay its debt. And everything came crashing down at that moment, not only in Mexico, but in the whole of Latin America. And a snowball effect started happening to the point that the 1980s are called here in Latin America, la década perdida, the lost decade. So I don't know, I mean, because I remember Jay kind of mentioned,
very interesting.
Jay kind of mentioned like how what happened then was like, these are kind of some of the most difficult times for Mexico, Latin America, and Mexico especially, but and I guess all of Latin America, but this because this not only, I mean, it's called the lost decade, but this decade, I mean, it wasn't, the repercussions weren't only felt during the 1980s. The repercussions have been going on and on and on, until the beginnings of the 21st century. But for me, it's kind of interesting because what that crash sort of highlights, that economic crash, is a kind of change or a kind of symptom that sort of is able to paint a more panoramic picture of a shift that happens between the 1970s and the 80s and 90s, the last decades of the 20th century. The crash was so massive because Mexico, as well as Brazil and Argentina especially, were countries that became highly, they owed a lot of money to international, to banks and international institutions, because this money had been, like in 1973, there was an oil crisis due to problems with Israel and the Middle Eastern countries, which, and this increased the price of oil. And this increase in the price of oil created a surplus of money, especially in oil-producing countries like Mexico. And this money was, taken into banks, and these banks started loaning, global South nations, third world nations, lending money. This money, especially in Latin America, this money was used for industrialization. It was an attempt to continue with industrialization, which had been started, especially speaking of Mexico, of Argentina, Brazil, Mexico. This money was used for the possibility of industrializing our nations, of creating the possibility of no longer needing to import expensive industrialized goods, and not only depending on the exportation of primary goods. This is kind of the dynamic of the third world nations, of the peripheral nations against the center. We produce cheap primary goods, and we have to buy expensive industrialized goods. And this trend of trying to industrialize was something that started with the populist. I mean, it didn't start in the 70s, it started before. It started with the populist governments, Peronismo in Argentina, Cardenismo in Mexico, Brazil, with even the governments previous to the military coup. This was
Vargas,
something which
right?
had Vargas, yes, exactly. This was something which started during the Second World War, and during after the Second World War. And Cárdenas, for example, in Mexico, and Jay mentioned him, is the president who nationalized oil. Was kind of one of the precursors of that impulse. These are called the first populist. I mean, I don't like that term, but it's called the first popular governments. And this, I mean, because that's something we have to understand. industrialization didn't, I mean, the idea that, it is the bourgeoisie that brings about industrialization, that's something which happens in the center. That's something which happens in Europe and in North America. Well, North America, not including Mexico. But industrialization in our nations happened through nationalization and through, it was a state enterprise mostly. Maybe Argentina is kind of different in that, because Argentina did have, like this a trader class of the people of the puerto, of Buenos Aires, But for at least for Mexico, industrialization didn't really come about. I mean, we didn't have a bourgeoisie. I mean, this is kind of an interesting thing which comes from dependency theory, which is a form of trying to understand all of this in sociology and politics and economy, of how the middle classes and how the bourgeoisies were formed in our countries, because we'd never really formed that in the strict Western sense of like a industrialist class. What we had was a comprador class. We had a bourgeoisie which was always subjected to the bourgeoisies of the center, and which in turn created dynamics of what Pablo Casanova, a very important sociologist who recently passed away here in Mexico, termed as internal colonialism. Forms of colonialism, of reproduction of colonialism, which come from the geopolitical structure into national structures. So it's interesting. I mean, it's kind of for me this moment, 1983, is kind of interesting because it marks a stark break from that possibility of industrialization for Mexico back into the forms of extraction economy, back into the forms now, under the guise of neoliberalism, now under the guise of the Washington Consensus. I mean, the Washington Consensus comes about in 1989, but, it's kind of like what it's being kind of prescribed there. And how the IMF, I mean, Mexico at that moment, the crisis was terrible. I mean, at that moment, at the point where Mexico in August says, we cannot pay our debts, because I mean, these debts had been sort of accumulating irresponsibly, but had been accumulating because there was this sense that, well, we can borrow money now because we've got oil and there's not going to be a problem. And this created this kind of like expensive, like this creation of, the rich got richer. The government had this, at the time. It was El País had an article which said that at the time the Mexican government had the biggest fleet. I'm sorry, that the fleet of jets in the world. This created this sort of idea that everything was going to get better, but there was still this impulse of trying to industrialize, of trying to change those forms. And at the moment when recession hits, because the specific problem was that, recession in the industrialized world, in the first world, recession started hitting, especially in the United States, and so they had to, raise the interest rates. The Fed had to raise the interest rates, and that created, I think it went from 10% to 19% interest rate, and that created this crazy amount of debt in Latin America, and which all of a sudden they couldn't pay, and this created the crisis. And then they had to start, lowering the price of the peso to the dollar, and this created inflation. This created all sorts of problems. But for me, it's kind of interesting because in 1973, 1974, I think it was the Soviet Union created, I wrote it down here somewhere, because it created a plan which was called how am I exactly, it's something like, it was a new economic, so there's no new economic world order or something like this. And what was trying to, what they tried to plan was a forms of economic cooperation, a relationship between between like the center and the periphery, which were more just, which were less, which created less of a dependency, because that's the logic. The logic of the center periphery is to create dependency in the peripheral nations, under the subjugation of neo-colonial or colonial forms of exploitation. And this this was created in that sort of also in that atmosphere of the non-aligned movement, which was a movement of the countries of the third world who wanted to get who were discussing things about how to cooperate amongst the countries which weren't from the center, and also the Bandung Conference and all these ideas which was sort of stemming forth from, I mean, from the independence movements, the national liberation movements in Africa and Asia, but also, you know, the populist governments, the nationalist governments in Latin America, and also the revolutions, you know, the Cuban, the Vietnam Revolution, which kind of were happening. So all of this, I mean, is little by little, you know, in forms of coercion and violence through the CIA, or in forms of financial strangling through the IMF. But these were all, one way or another, you know, they were, you know, they were stopped. They were, they were strangled. They were being, you know, taken
Interesting.
away.
So Mexico wanted to use, however, you know, repressive and corrupt the previous governments of, you know, of the pre were, actually did want to use the nationalization programs that they did, particularly with oil, to benefit the people. But this is the time of the 1980s, and the Reagan Thatcher revolutions
Yeah.
basically like dropped any kind of like consensus in that, right?
Yeah, I mean, of course, this wasn't like, I mean, for example, for Mexico, this wasn't perfect. I mean, this industrialization was something which came about by the ruling party, the PRI party, which was kind of the hegemonic party which had ruled Mexico since since after the revolution. I mean, I mean, the PRI party comes around 1929, but it first called PNR, El Partido Nacional Revolucionario, the National Revolutionary Party. Then it changes to the PMR, the Party of the Mexican Revolution, and then in the 1940s, exactly when, it turns into the PRI, you know, the Partido Revolución Institucional.
But before we talk actually about pre, then, because I think what Pilger's documentary I think perfectly captures is that, you know, when one thinks of, you know, Mexico and U.S. Mexican relations, one thinks of a very colonial relation where Mexico is often exploited by U.S. corporations and many multinationals from Europe and Canada, but we'll focus specifically on, you know, on U.S. Mexican relationships, and that the U.S. tends to prop up a very regressive oligarchy and competing drug cartels. So, talk to us about this and how it's developed from the Monroe Doctrine era to the Cold War era, and you know, later, and then later NAFTA, which we'll later do a deep dive into that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I mean, it's kind of interesting because, and this is something which I'm taking from the analysis of dependency theory about Mexico and about what PRI meant, what this party kind of meant in this in its development from you know, the PRI kind of is what comes out of the Mexican Revolution, and the moment of the moment when the revolution kind of, because historians kind of differ exactly when does the Mexican Revolution end. Some say it ends around, you know, like just before the religious wars, and some say it ends with Lázaro Cárdenas. Kind of Lázaro Cárdenas is the logical progression of the revolution. One of the things that kind of dependency theory discusses specifically is the fact, why didn't Mexico have coups? You know, why wasn't there military coups in Mexico as compared to other Latin American countries, right? And what we have to understand about the PRI, about how the PRI kind of formed itself, it's kind of highly complex. I mean, the PRI became this bastion of I mean, it wasn't just a monolith in many aspects. It seems like a monolith. It seems like an all-powerful uh, uh, totalitarian. I hate using that word because of how it's been taken by critical theory and all that. But it kind of sort of like it felt like it was a sort of a monolith. But in reality, what the PRI kind of did was that all of the class antagonisms that might have been exterior to an organization, to a political institution, in other countries were sort of imbibed by this political structure. So you had a political structure which came out of the revolution as a form of uh, sort of a procuring or maintaining the gains of the revolution, but at the same time as a political form of uh, becoming an obstacle or becoming a or becoming something like like the thermidor, the thermidor in the French Revolution, of becoming something which sort of betrays the revolution, the progressive possibilities of the revolution. So the pre-party sort of comes about in this in this comes about like this at this institution at the end of the revolution. And it's a strange form because it has both like unions and peasant worker organizations within its ranks, but it also has the little industrial class that Mexico might have had. It also has them there, and it also has like the intellectual class, and it also has like the bureaucracy and the government, and they're all there, in that massive, hegemon, in that monolith, in that thing which was a PRI, and the antagonisms were there inside. And this is
Yes, in
what,
fact, in fact, I mean, this is one of my questions. That one can't talk about Mexican history without, of course, talking about the Pre-Party, which in English is the Institutional Revolutionary Party, and the Nobel Prize winner in literature in 1990, Peruvian novelist Mario Vargas Llosa, who unfortunately is a liberal and is a economic he's an economic liberal, so he's not a socialist. But that being said, he this is how he described the pre-party. He described Mexico under the pre as being the perfect dictatorship, stating, "I don't believe there has been in Latin America any case of a system of dictatorship which has so efficiently recruited the intellectual milieu, bribing it with great subtlety. The perfect dictatorship is not communism, nor the USSR, nor Fidel Castro. The perfect dictatorship is Mexico, because it is a camouflage dictatorship." The phrase became popular in Mexico and around the world until the pre fell from power in 2000, which we're later going to talk about the other party. But yeah, your thoughts on that. So one can't talk about Mexico, whether it's the Monroe Doctrine era, it's the Cold War era, to NAFTA, without, of course, talking about the pre-party.
yes. I mean, I think we can like go back to this idea from the Monroe Doctrine to the modern era in a bit. Yeah, I mean, I remember that Vargas Llosa interviews. Um, it's kind of a legendary thing because he said it on television. There was this like just about when the century was about to end. The television, the main television company here, the main mainstream media television company, which was then the television company which it was under the orders of the Plea Party, decided to make this sort of a series of programs where they invited the most important intellectuals in Mexico and in Latin America to discuss the end of the century and the coming of the new century.
Interesting.
And so Vargas Llosa comes on in one of these discussions, and he decides to give this now well-known speech about la dictadura perfecta, the perfect dictatorship. And I don't know if this is stuff of legend or no. I mean, this is something from a long time ago. I mean, I can't remember if the TV signal went off or if it didn't went off. I mean, this is all going to be like a little bit of legend, no. But Vargas Llosa was hurried out of the country really fast. He was kind of like said, okay, so you better leave now. And it's funny to see what like But I mean, I guess that's how many intellectuals function, right? I mean, they're always trying to be the voice of reason outside, but at the same time they depend on the funds given by those, by those institutions that, Vargas Llosa now, you see Vargas Llosa now as this, what he's become, like compared to what he used to write about, and now he's this kind of like, I think he even has like a Spanish nobility title, and how
Yeah,
he's
yeah,
yeah
yeah.
he's
And in terms of his politics, I mean, uh, I think Saheli perfectly described Latin America as that. Like Latin America does not have a center right; it's just far right. And
yeah
Vargas, and let's be honest, Vargas, unfortunately, like yeah, he believes in liberal democracy, so he really does believe in like capitalism, and that if you just have a good balance between a middle class and not so much this huge gap between rich and poor, all will be grand. But yeah, he is no socialist, unfortunately. So a lot of times when people read him now and read his take on Latin American affairs, like I think he was very hostile towards Hugo Chavez, very hostile
yeah
towards
yeah. I mean, he's
any center left to broad left movements, which is
yeah no. I
unfortunate.
mean,
But he is right on the money with how he described pre in Mexico.
yeah, it's funny how he did that at that very moment. I mean, that sort of that cycle of conferences that were given by the television company back then. I think they even had Adolfo Sanchez Vasquez, which was kind of a Marxist philosopher from who was a he was well he was Mexican Spanish because he was one of the he was exiled from Spain during the Civil War, and he came to Mexico. It was kind of an interesting moment, and that which happened was kind of like, that moment was very interesting when he said that, because he said it on Televisa, which was the company, it's a private company, but it's a company which was always at the service of the PRI party. They even referred to themselves as soldiers of the PRI. The director, I mean, the CEO of Televisa once referred to themselves, "Somos los soldados del PRI." We are we're the soldiers of PRI, or the president. I can't remember if it's the president or the PRI, but yeah, I mean, it was kind of a very, I guess, in your face moment that he did that. But I guess at that moment, it was more than obvious how this political structure functioned. But anyway, I mean, as I said, the PRI was all of the antagonisms, class antagonisms that could have been external, were kind of put in there, and there's also kind of stages. The PRI sort of changed. It had like a much more nationalist forms of thinking from the middle of the 20th century up to the end. And it's funny. I mean, it's interesting because going back to Lopez Portillo and going back to the Pilger documentary, recently there was some documents, the Kennedy assassination documents were declassified, I think. I don't know if last year or the year before that. I think it was last year they were declassified. And it's interesting to see in those documents that Díaz Ordaz, which was the president during the last part of the 60s, I mean, from the 60s, Echeverria, which was the president in the first first half of the 70s, and then Lopez Portillo, had all been CIA informants. They had all worked, I mean, previous to being presidents, as CIA informants, and those documents mention them there as CIA informants. So
Wow.
so it's kind of interesting to see how the PRI, being this sort of like economic, political, military form of oppressive government, with all these class antagonisms and all these contradictions within it, sort of held a much more nationalist position, a position that sort of kind of reflected in Mexico's foreign relations, the focus of the foreign relations, but at the same time, how this slowly changed, and how the years which sort of loomed towards that change, which happened in 1982, uh, were part of this, of how empire functions. Vijay Prashad mentioned this, like there's two forms of coercion, right? I mean, it's either through CIA coups or through IMF coups. You can either, try and destroy governments by, by forms of, stealth forms, or you can either you just bring in your economists and tell the countries to, impose austerity measures.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is what exactly happened at that moment when the John Pilger documentary comes out. When Mexico goes into default, Mexico is unable to pay that. Mexico then has to ask help from the IMF. The IMF comes in. López Portillo finished his term at that point. He finishes his term at that point, and then Miguel de la Madrid, which is an ex-president, comes in. But Miguel de la Madrid is a very different type of priista, is a very different type of free president from the previous ones. The previous ones up to López Portillo still had even if he was a CIA informant, they still had this, they still kept this idea of a nationalist project. A project which was, in certain terms, as I mentioned, part of that industrialization, that sort of a program of industrialization and of changing things in Mexico. So from the point of Miguel de la Madrid, who was our first president to have like a postgraduate studies in Harvard. He was a technocrat. It was a completely different form of pre-government. This is the moment when it changes, and this is a moment when the IMF comes in and gives Mexico its lineaments, or it tells them what to do. It tells them that he has to bring in austerity measures. He has to all the things he has to do, and this brings about the lost decade. This brings about what would be like many governments after which would impose neoliberal measures. And going back to this question about the Monroe Doctrine, what has changed, these are the forms now, for Mexico. This is what brought about those decades, those many, presidents, from Miguel de la Madrid to Salinas de Gortari to Ernesto Cedillo, then to Fox, and then to Calderón, and then after that to Peña Nieto, which would maintain that line of austerity measures, and which would maintain which would toe that line of the Washington Consensus until López Obrador, which
exactly, and it seems as if and of course we are going to talk about AMLO. That that basically in the Pilger documentary, he was already covering the mass. Well, I wouldn't say mass exodus, but was covering the huge problem of a lot of Mexicans who are in chronic poverty. Even those who do work on farms and so forth, many of them face chronic poverty and exploitation. So many of them felt that they had to go to the United States in search of a better life, and that still is ongoing. And of course, the drug war, which the U.S. Constantly wages in Mexico, and so, of course, all the corruption of the CIA supporting this cartel over that cartel is also part of a lot of Mexicans and other Central Americans and Latin Americans fleeing for a search for a better life in the United States. Now, the PRI is a big tent right-wing party, and their winning streak finally ended in 2000. They weren't replaced by a left-wing alternative. They were replaced by a rival right-wing party, PAN, which in English is the National Action Party. And from 2000 to 2006, the president of Mexico was Vicente Fox. International audience, of course, probably are familiar with Fox for his many interviews when responding to Donald Trump about building a border wall that Mexico had to pay for. He, of course, said many times that I'm not going to pay for that fucking wall. And, of course, his many popular, recordings hilariously mocking Trump. But it's important to remind people, especially left-leaning folks and those not politically educated to Mexico, that Vicente Fox is not a left-leaning person. He's a right-winger, and he was no friend to the Mexican working class because a lot of the policies he pursued, neoliberalism and NAFTA, caused many people in Mexico to fleeing to the United States illegally and legally in search for a better life. And he also waged, the drug war brutally, which is funny because when he left office, he said that pot and drug consumption shouldn't be criminalized. It is overpenalized, and that it should be legalized. So talk to us about so talk to us briefly about his legacy and how he continued more or less the right wing terror of pre, right?
Yeah, well, something which is interesting to mention is how the PAN comes about, the party PAN, because the PAN party began in the 1930s in Mexico. And actually, the PAN party uh, begins as a reaction to Cardenismo, to Cárdenas, because Cárdenas was, in some aspects, a socialist. He was not so openly, but some things refer to him as having some a socialist streak. So that is something else which dependency theory mentions, and it's just kind of interesting. The PRI party, at this moment of the PRI party, as was happening in many other countries in the world, is a time when there's the influence of fascism. Fascism is kind of surging in Italy, fascism in Spain, and this influences some sectors of Mexico, which then form the PAN, the Partido Acción Nacional, as you mentioned, the National Action Party. This is a Catholic Christian orientated conservative party, which kind of englobes or encircles those sectors of Mexican society, which we could maybe call like a petit bourgeoisie or a bourgeoisie, or some of the industrial of the industrialists. As I was saying, Mexico didn't really have that much of an industrialist class. That class, and much part of that class was belonged to the PRI. But there's also certain sectors of the country which later on developed, especially in northern Mexico and Monterrey and in other places, which had a much more conservative form of thinking, and which didn't feel that they could that their interests or their ideology was met by the PRI party, despite the fact that the PRI kind of like englobed so many different aspects. But the nationalism of the PRI and the revolutionary of the PRI and the supposed idea that the PRI would still kind of contain those revolutionary and nationalist elements taken from the revolution, many of these sectors which created the PAN were not happy with this. So they decided to create this party as a reaction to specifically to Cardenismo. So this is how the PAN party begins. And the PAN
If I can,
party,
sorry to interrupt, but if I can compare
yes,
that to another country, so the PRI is a big tent right wing party, but in order to keep a lid on power, they had to, of course, give some crumbs. They had to concede some stuff to the
yes, yes,
Mexican working
yes,
class. So that's why they had like nationalization, which so that's why they had some industries which were nationalized, and why they would sometimes give people they would raise people's minimum wage and so forth. So Pan is attacking pre, even though many of us would consider pre right wing, but Pan attacks them from the right, and that's kind of and I guess you could sort of compare that to Vargas and Juan Perón, who did have their right wing streaks, but when they were deposed, when they were both deposed, though, it was from the reactionary right wingers and the military. So yeah, I'm curious your
yeah,
response
yeah.
to that
No,
before.
no, definitely. I mean, as I was saying, the PAN comes about, as a party, the moment when the PRI was most progressive and radical, which is with Cárdenas. Cárdenas, the person who Cárdenas not only nationalized oil, he before López Obrador, he's the president which has created the most natural protected areas in Mexico, and he was a president who helped to um, institutionalize those calls for land reform, which had, which the revolution had sort of, which was kind of one of the emblems of the revolution. So there's a lot of at the
And they
moment when
were
the pan
also a
comes up.
little bit hostile towards the church, right? Like they insisted about the separation of church and state, and
Exactly, yeah.
they respect the church, the Catholic Church, that is, as this cultural part of Mexico, a central part of Mexico, but very strict on like separation of church and state, and they would be very they would sanction the church if the church ever was to come out against well, such and such
Yeah.
political party, political candidate, and whatnot.
Yeah, because I mean the band party kind of also represents the interest of the church, represents the interest of the Catholic Church, which were not exactly represented as you mentioned in the PRI, because this is something which comes from the 19th century, like with Benito Juarez. It's kind of like that moment when there's also an antagonism between the interests of the church in Mexico and the interests of creating a much more secular form of liberal federalist government, all the way from the 19th century. And this kind of this there's a legacy of that, which with the PRI also held. But this is the most progressive moment of the PRI, the moment when Lázaro Cárdenas, and then later when electricity was nationalized too, because that was another thing which was done during the PRI, when the time when the PRI was when that party had kind of like a much more nationalist project, and the PAN comes out in that moment. And yes, there's during the 20th century, we can see kind of like a difference between the more conservative, more extreme right-wing aspects of the PAN and the PRI as separate. But as the century comes to a close, that that division or that possible difference slowly starts to erase to the point where both parties start to come together, understanding that they both represent the interests of the elites, both represent the interests of the upper classes. And with Fox, what we see is the possibility of alternation of the PRI party, of the ruling of the PRI party, which had lasted like all of the like most of the 20th century, coming to an end, and allowing the right wing, the PAN as a right wing party, to alternate in power. But this is allowed because both parties represent the interests of the of the um, of the upper classes.
Yeah.
Of course, before that, in 1988, there was an electoral fraud when Salinas de Gortari came into power, and there was the son of Lázaro Cárdenas, his son, run for office, and he won that election. But there was a fraud not to allow him to come into office, and it was in that moment when the PAN was already involved with the PRI, was started becoming involved as a force that could help the PRI to uh, for what the powers that be to stay in power, to, sorry, redundancy aside, for the elites not to lose power. And as the century, developed, as the last part of the century, and as Fox came along, and as there was, and then Calderon, and there's this alternation between PRI and PAN. What we really see is that both PRI and PAN became what is known as PRIAN. Now, both parties may seem separate, but both parties represent the interests of the upper classes, and both parties work together. We saw it in this last election. The opposing candidate against Claudia Sheinbaum, Xochitl Galvez, was she considers herself as a like as a independent candidate, some sort of she said, I am of the civil society, whatever civil society means. And we could go back to Hegel to try and understand that a little bit, but those parties were behind her, and Xochitl Galvez had worked in the Fox administration, and had been a senator and she had also been a mayor of Miguel Hidalgo at one of the municipalities of Mexico City under the PAN. And she had always been banned, but like this campaign was supposedly a campaign, you know, like a civil society campaign, but it was, you know, a pre-ban PRD, which was you know, like a left-wing party which had betrayed the left in Mexico and then had joined these parties. And this kind of sort of gives you the idea that, you know, as the ban, which had become which at the beginning had formed sort of like a reaction against the more progressive elements within that stage of that historic stage of PRI being a little more progressive. Then as you know, as the PRI started becoming more repressive and then more neoliberal, you know, the PAN naturally, you know, like, you know, became one because of the same interests.
Is it safe to say then that Vicente Fox, when he was elected, that it wasn't so much that the Mexican public were hungry for more, for more, you know, neo-colonial policies, neoliberalism, whatever people want to call it. I call it reactionary capitalism, but but people voted for him. Number one, just as a protest vote against the PRI, or was it more, or yeah? So was it that, but also just you know, Pan was able to mobilize their uh, their forces, their electorates, because that is unfortunately the only major opposition to PRI.
Yeah. Well, all of the above, as you mentioned, actually, it's
Okay.
kind of it was kind of a strange moment because we have to see the historically the moment 2000 that year we're coming out of this idea of the, you know, the Soviet Union has fallen, you know, the actually existing uh, projects of Marxism, you know, they're no longer you know, they're no longer prevalent, they're no longer useful. So it's you know, Fox wins within this notion of the end of history, you know, that moment when there's supposedly changes, you know, the Berlin Wall falls, you know, like Soviet Russia collapses. This kind of the moment of the 90s where you know, there's a search for alternatives, but the alternatives are no longer real concrete, you know, alternatives from communism, from socialism, real concrete alternatives or even from national liberation in the global south. These alternatives are brushed aside as useless. You know, that was the 70s. That was the colonial movements. No, we need to, you know, like we need to find, you know, more human forms of capitalism, as you mentioned, and all this.
Human
So Fox is
human forms of
yeah.
capitalism. No,
Yeah, or humanist, so I don't know how to say it. Like,
that's kind of like what the former Czechoslovakia was trying to do with with the Prague Spring, commun
yeah,
socialism with a human face. So that's
yeah. So
interesting
you
that
know, like,
that's how they would sell their approach to capitalism.
yeah, no, and so Fox comes out in that moment. He's his campaign. I mean, you know, there's a sense of Mexico wants an alternative. And there's a sense of like, if the Berlin Wall fell and if the Soviet Union fell and if the Cold War ended, then why can't the PRI fall? You know, that was the sort of a sense. So there's this whole apparatus, this whole media and intellectual apparatus telling you that the left is no longer a viable, that the left-wing project, you know, like the social, the communist, you know, the actually existing projects are no longer viable, they're passé, so we need an alternative. So Fox comes along that I am that alternative, and he's sold as a, you know, it's his that campaign was, I mean, I think it's funny because I think what they tried to do with Xochitl's campaign, like this year, this election, was to replicate what Fox had done during that campaign. Fox sold himself as a folksy, you know, provincial, down to earth, you know, cowboy boot wearing sort of a person from El Bajío, from Guanajuato in Mexico. This is kind of like, you know, more country areas, you know, like, and this guy has a rancho, you know, he has a ranch, he has an hacienda. He's a folksy. They try to sell him as a folksy dude, no
And
bullshit.
compassionate conservative, a compassionate
Yeah, exactly. You
conservative,
know,
like a
like
Christian Democrat type of.
Yeah, 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 exactly. And you know, this is a time when Bush will become president as well, as a folksy Texan sort of thing. So kind of like Fox is sort of an equivalent, you know, like he's from Guanajuato, he wears cowboy boots, he says it like it is, you know. Fox would always sort of be like, oh, I say it like it is. He would be, you know, like rude, he would swear, he would do all this kind of like crazy antics to try to show you that he was just a folksy guy. He was just saying like it is, and he would, you know, he's a known nonsense guy. And people were kind of like, okay, so we have the politicians, you know, like these politicians that are always, you know, lying, that are always smiling, fake, you know, with fake smiles, who would always, so, you know, who would always steal from you, but, you know, they tell you that, you know, like they're doing it for you and all of this. So Fox seemed like an alternative to what that was. What they didn't tell us during that campaign was the fact that, for starters, Fox, I think, he didn't have an undergraduate degree, which is no problem. I mean, there's very intelligent people who don't need one, but they were telling you like, they didn't tell you the fact that Fox had been CEO of Coca-Cola before being president. That Fox
What?
was
Wow,
representing,
interesting.
yeah, Fox was representing the interests of the private sector in Mexico more than the interests of the people. So that campaign was a very successful campaign because of all this, you know, like saying it like it is antics, you know, like people wanted change and said, yeah, okay, so this seems like let's try this. I mean, we've had decades of this other thing. I mean, we've had the lost decade, we've had, you know, crisis because Mexico also had a financial crisis in 1993, 94, which was also a very, very harsh crisis. And we were just coming out of that crisis. So when Fox comes out with this alternative, people, of course, think, well, yeah, I mean, well, let's try this. And well, you know how that went. Like he was just as corrupt, just as you know, like a lying cheat, just as you know, he was just as you know, as terrible as the other ones.
That's
And
okay.
then
Yeah, no, go
no,
ahead.
sorry, sorry.
No, no,
And
okay,
then, you
go
know,
ahead.
oh, thank you. Sorry. No, I was just saying that, and Fox, you know, people weren't convinced by Fox because in 2006, that election was probably won. Well, it was won by López Obrador. That was the first time he ran for president. But there was another electoral fraud to put Calderón, an electoral fraud orchestrated by Fox. And he has admitted it. He said, "Yeah, I would do it. You know, it's my duty to not allow, you know, this communist, this, you know, like you know, like this commie to come into power." And that's how Calderon comes into power. You know, it's not that, you know, it's not that people were happy with Fox and then that his predecessor, you know, was voted in. It was that people weren't so happy. They wanted then another alternative. They wanted López Obrador, but López Obrador wasn't allowed to become president in 2006 or in 2012 either.
Fascinating, and yes, and after Fox's time in office came Felipe Calderon, as you mentioned, part of the same party, December 2006, November 2012. Pre returned to power, Pre came back into power under what I call a young but bootlicker for aggressive capitalists and Western imperial interests, Enrique Pena Nieto. But we're not going to talk about their legacies where which they continued, you know, to assault the working class and destitute poor. We are now, of course, going to talk about the rise of AMLO. So let's talk about AMLO, his legacy, what gets overlooked about his major gains, however small or big, and talk to us about, about the mass right wing opposition to him domestically, and I have several follow up questions related to AMLO's legacy, but yeah, talk to us about like the rise of AMLO and some of the major, and some of his popular policies, which get overlooked in the international press, particularly even the left wing press.
Yeah, it's you know, well, we can like I think like last time we talked when I was with the people from Orinoco Tribune, we kind of like talked a little about AMLO, and you know now that like his 6 year term is over, now that his presidential term has finished, I mean it's kind of it's kind of interesting to look at the whole thing, like a whole, like a totality of what has happened during this time. And I also think that, as you mentioned, as how, like in your question, like how he's seen by the West. This is kind of interesting. And you had mentioned also in regard to the article we had discussed a while back, the article you sent to me, which I didn't know about, by Eric
Yes,
London, right?
exactly. Yeah, that I have it in one of my questions, but
Okay, no, but
oh no, yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
no. I mean, I think actually I was thinking about this article because which you sent back then, and what he mentioned back then. I mean, this article hasn't aged that well, but I think it's interesting because it gives like a perspective of how, this is something which I want to touch upon. I mean, it's not. I mean, how AMLO is perceived in the West. I mean, how AMLO is perceived in the Anglo-European world, not just by the right wing, but by the left wing as well, right? How this idea of the national liberation movements of the periphery are perceived by those uh, by the leftism of the center. But I mean, yeah, I mean,
In fact, in fact, what what Gabriel is referring to is I had come across this article in the World Socialist website, and the World Socialist website does a lot of fine work, does a lot of fine activism, does a lot of fine journalism. I've had members of the World Socialist website come on the program to discuss British affairs, New Zealand affairs, and Australian affairs. But this but but I do disagree with them on on issues sometimes. And this article by Eric London, which I'm going to make sure that the readers get a chance to read, after we're done, recording, was a very critical article about AMLO and this press conference he apparently gave to Donald Trump. And long story short, but Eric London in the World Socialist website, they sort of depict AMLO as this pseudo leftist that chose profits over the people when it came to the pandemic, and that he is slavish when it comes to American imperialism, and often just does mostly what Mexican business and what a reactionary bourgeoisie wants in Mexico. So yeah, so I think it's important when when and of course you're going to explain to us, how AMLO actually did a lot of good for the Mexican people because yes, there is this negative reception of AMLO, very similar to when Lula was in power. Now, most of the Western left is very complimentary about Hugo Chavez and, of course, people of the past like Salvador Allende. But a lot of the left was very hostile towards Lula, depicting Lula as just another corrupt politician. And it was only when Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept. The Intercept, I also people have their criticisms of The Intercept as well. But it was only when Glenn Greenwald exposed how much of the opposition towards Lula was from a very reactionary right wing. And then, of course, came Brazil Wire, the fantastic stuff that that Brian Muir would do, in which people realize that actually, wait a minute, Lula, like if Lula was an American, we would be praising him because he would basically be this sort of center left social reformer, like like a Jeremy Corbyn or a Bernie Sanders. Now, AMLO, and that's basically AMLO, in a nutshell. John Ackerman even described AMLO as being, he's not a boxer or a football player. He's a very careful chess player, right?
Yes, definitely. I mean, yes. Actually, there's been an instance this week. We can talk about that later, but I think it's an interesting example of what a shrewd, I mean, what a shrewd politician, what a like someone who knows politics very well, López Obrador, how good he is at knowing politics. There's something which happened this week, but we'll discuss that later because it has to do with Scheinbaum and just this first week of after Scheinbaum's victory. But yeah, I mean, no, thank you for introducing that article because I mean I didn't know about the article. You mentioned to me back then, like when I was still in Orinoco, and I found it quite interesting because as what you mentioned is. And I even been, like I was rereading recently my Lenin, this book about the left wing communism and infantile disorder, about because I think it is important, I want to get to what Lopez Obrador's gains, but also to understanding, what Lenin discusses there as understanding about tactics, about when is it really possible to consider, from the perspective of the left wings of the center of the left wings of the Anglo-European world, trying to criticize the projects which are happening in a totally different context of the periphery. But like I mentioned this article because I was, since you mentioned it, I found it kind of interesting, and I do think there's some things which kind of are interesting to go into, uh, which has to do with a fact of what is mentioned specifically there as a critique, and what has happened like 6 years on. And the first thing, that article, and I'm going to quote the article because I think it's interesting, he's talking about, when, as you mentioned, when Lopez Obrador visits Trump in the United States, is his first. Lopez Obrador didn't really want to go out of Mexico. He didn't really want to be that kind of president who was, like at Davos, or he didn't want to be at the G20 or any of like the other previous presidents did, because those presidents were all the time traveling and, like they're neglecting the country. I mean, Milei is doing right now. It's the type of thing that Milei does now, right? But I think that kind of like what's interesting about what is criticized is that AMLO is only, AMLO is not wasn't really about helping the working class, wasn't really about helping the most underprivileged people, the marginal classes of Mexico, the marginal the marginal population, and like I want to go back to the article because I think it's kind of interesting to go a little bit by bit, but I don't want to like get too critical either because I know you're friends and everything, but
Go ahead. And if they have a right of reply, they'll have a right of reply. And maybe in the future we can even do a debate about AMLO's legacy. So don't be afraid.
Perfect. Well, the article says, quoting the article, it's talking about AMLO being in with Trump, and it says this exchange shows why the Mexican president's visit is so unpopular in Mexico. AMLO's poll numbers are sinking as Mexico climbs in the global rankings of coronavirus deaths. We're talking about the moment of the pandemic, and I want to start here because it's kind of interesting for me. I think one of the things about this article which kind of struck me. It's a very short article, but it's an article which what struck me is the lack of rigor of the article. The article says things which they do not quote, and I don't know if they think like, oh no, references are for tankies, or I don't know what Trotskyists would say, but this struck me funny because one of the things we can first look is at the approval ratings of AMLO, and I wrote them down because I think it's kind of interesting, when Lopez Obrador, when this article was written, Lopez Obrador had back then, like Gallup did a poll, and at the time when recently Gallup did a poll like this year, and at the time when Lopez Obrador became president up to now, the approval rating has doubled of a government. Before, I mean, what people considered as approval ratings of the government before Lopez Obrador and to what they consider now has doubled. I mean, this is this is something which, like since Gallup started doing polls in Mexico in 2006, this had never happened before. This is, like a historic first. So if we look at that moment, if we look at, and I'm going to quote like conservative sources, domestic conservative, which is Reforma, which is a newspaper, which is a right-wing newspaper, and they gave at that moment they gave López Obrador like from 55 to 60% approval rating at the moment when this article is written. And also, if we look at the Morning Consult presidential, popularity listings, at that moment when López Obrador went to see Trump, he was the second most popular leader in the world. So it just strikes me funny that it says here that he was so unpopular. And what is even more striking is the fact that that visit with Trump was a moment that was seen not only by Mexicans in Mexico, but by Mexicans in the United States as a pivotal moment of what AMLO was about and how AMLO was going to function in a totally different way towards the United States. This article is very harsh because, if we remember that moment, the moment when AMLO went to see Trump, it was a moment when there was a campaign going on between Trump and Biden. And Trump had invited AMLO and had invited Trudeau to the United States. And Trudeau decided not to go because there was a campaign going on. And this was going to mean that that AMLO, that was going to mean that by being there, they were kind of supporting Trump against Biden.
Yeah.
So Trudeau decided not to go, but AMLO decided to go. And this was seen, like by many as the fact that, AMLO was stooping to Trump, and he was kind of helping him in his campaign, in his campaign against Biden. But AMLO was conscious that he had to go because there was things that needed to be discussed with Trump, and it was this kind of struck me funny because that moment was a very important moment for Mexicans in the United States, for immigrants who had always been kind of supportive of AMLO, and who are very supportive of him when he goes to the United States. Like when AMLO goes to the US, he always takes commercial flights. He doesn't, he sold the presidential plane. So he's always arriving there, in economy class. He doesn't even fly business or anything like that. He just arrives in the United States and becomes a nightmare for the Secret Service, right? Because there's all these Mexican immigrants who want to be with him outside his hotel. And this is crazy because AMLO, this is kind of like, this is called, like Republican austerity. It's not the austerity of the people, but it's the austerity of the government. The government has to cut down its expenses. And those expenses mean, cutting down on not flying, private jets, or not flying, presidential planes or anything like this. But yeah, I mean, if we look back then, his numbers were not plummeting. His numbers were quite high. And if we look now, for example, the latest Gallup poll, he's seen and this is a Gallup poll as of, I think this is the last month, I think. His personal approval went up to 80%. I mean, if you look at how presidents fare regarding popularity or approval, they usually start with good approval, but by the end of the term or by the end of their administration, usually popularity approval goes down. But this is funny. López Obrador's approval has gone up to 80%. Who has 80%? I mean, when Peña Nieto came out of office, he had 22%. When Calderon came out of office, he had 50 something, I can't remember, 55, 53 something percent approval rating. So for starters, if we just
and why do you think he was becoming so popular? Like what policies was he doing that made that made him popular?
Yeah, I mean, if we go back to this article is was kind of criticizing AMLO because saying, like during that time when he went to see Trump, the meeting there was filled with people from the private sector, both from the United States and from Mexico. And López Obrador only favors the rich. Is only looking after the interests of the wealthy. He's only looking after the interests of the maquiladoras. He's only looking after. But okay, let's now that the 6 years have passed, let's look at what has happened in this government. And unfortunately, it's so much. I don't think I'm going to say some of the things, but it's too much. I mean, I'm not going to be able to say everything that has happened, right?
Okay.
So, for example, let's start with unemployment. Unemployment right now is a historic low of 2.3. From the beginning of, this has never happened before in Mexico. This is the lowest it's been ever, for a long time. And also the actual, per capita earnings, the actual, the worth of your salary. I mean, the worth of your earnings compared to, like primary goods, has, the poverty levels of the salaries have gone down. They went down from 37.7 to 35.8. So, salaries, this means that, what you can buy, your salary, what you can get with your salary, the worth of your salary has gone up. The minimum wage in Mexico, has had an unprecedented 110% increase from 2018 to 2024. And this means that poverty levels in Mexico were reduced to lower than 40%. Total poverty went from 43.9% to 36.3%. And extreme poverty went from 8.5% to 7%. So that this in people, the numbers would be, it went from 59.9 million poor people to 46.8 million poor people. This means that 5 million people were lifted out of poverty in Mexico during AMLO's time in power. Now, 5 million people is I mean, it's 5 million people. I mean, there's many cities in Europe which are less than 5 million people, and interestingly enough, 5 million people is the margin of votes that Claudia Sheinbaum got more than López Obrador when he was during his election. I mean, Claudia Sheinbaum is the candidate has gotten more votes in the history of elections of Mexico. She's the candidate that has received more votes. No other candidate has received more votes than her. And the difference with AMLO is the 5 million people, which symbolically is the 5 million people that left poverty in Mexico during the time of López Obrador. Now, if you look, for example, at China, 800 million people were lifted out of poverty. But you see how, like if you have like a structured state, like a socialist state, which can focus and program these things in a long time. They said by the year so and so we would lift. There would be no longer extreme poverty in China.
And a lot of the policies that AMLO did was also just basic economics. So those who were working in various factories and those who work in a lot of the gig economy, but even those who work in major manufacturing were just given their right to a proper minimum wage.
Yes, exactly. Yes. It's now being constitutionally mandated that the minimum wage can never be below the inflation. Because before you had increases in wages, but there was always below inflation. But now, I mean, by law, wages will always have to be on top of inflation. So this is another of the gains of this administration. I mean, but I was saying, like in China, you can look forward in such ways that you can, program these kinds of things. But for López Obrador to do this in 6 years, considering the antagonisms, considering the drawbacks, the setbacks, difficulties, The fact that, he didn't have like, he only had like a simple majority in the legislative branch and all this has been something important. At least for 5 million people, this has changed their lives considerably. Um,
And
so
does AMLO back then and now, does he have the support of the Mexican diaspora, those who share dual nationalities with the U.S. and Mexico, and does he have the support of mainly the working class, but also middle class and upper class illegal immigrants? And if the answer is no, why not? I'm curious your response.
yeah, no, actually, it's he has the support. I mean, it's interesting how, as I was mentioning to you, like when AMLO has gone to visit the United States, he's gone on, like on trips to the United States. It's I mean, it's interesting to see how people will, go to New York or go to Washington to see AMLO and be outside his hotel and, like and and show support for AMLO. I mean, everybody could say that this is just political antics. That isn't true. But one of the things that AMLO also did during this administration is it's helped to for the people from the United States who send their money over to the family in Mexico, the people who are working out of Mexico, immigrants. They have Mexico. Sorry, AMLO created a bank, el Banco del Bienestar, because so this is like a state-owned bank created for the purpose of having branches in the places where private banks wouldn't go there. They wouldn't touch those places with a 10-foot pole. So, for example, my father lives in a semi-urban area, like in Oaxaca. Is San Pedro Isla Huaca is a small place in Oaxaca, and we're talking about a small village which now has a bank where, if your family members in the United States, they can send money without having to pay, high interest or, like pay a fee for that.
Ah,
So,
so so so
like,
so he's very popular.
yes, and
So he's one of the few Mexican left-leaning presidents to actually be quite popular amongst the broad classes of the diaspora,
yeah,
the
yeah, no,
working
definitely.
class, the bourgeoisie, and the very affluent. Then,
Yeah, I mean, I suppose like the Mexicans who live in Miami, those Mexicans like, who the Mexicans who like own businesses and who like ex-politicians who with all the money they stole and they buy houses in Miami or mainstream media, like presenters and journalists who get money, from the US and that and who live in Miami. I suppose they hate AMLO. Yeah, of course they do. Like I don't know why Miami always attracts the worst kind of characters from Latin America, but yeah, that's another story. But like those people, of course, hate AMLO, and I can like I bet there's like lots of people also in San Diego, like middle class Mexicans, we now call them white Texicans, like Mexicans who act like white people, who want to be white people, and they if those people who like who are in the United States and have it, have like a certain political tendencies, they probably hate AMLO too. But like if we talk about the like the working class diaspora, the people who are like bussing tables and who are like working in the construction sites in the United States. I mean, they feel that there's kind of like a representation from AMLO uh, towards this this whole uh, uh, migratory dynamic of Mexicans having to leave Mexico because of all the neoliberal policies that diminished and impoverished the countryside through drug trafficking or through like not incentivizing agriculture, which was one of the forces that made people leave Mexico ever since when the Pilger documentary was on, which was not such a large phenomena. But after that, with the neoliberal implementations and with drug trafficking, and when that phenomenon just boosted, so yeah, I think that in a certain way that has changed. I mean, also during this last election, the government tried to ensure the people abroad were able to vote. And there's many criticisms I hold some criticisms against how the Secretary of Foreign Relationship has worked and how perhaps they could have been more effective when it comes to helping migrants in the United States. But that's kind of another story. But like the actual, I mean, but there's been a push to help these people participate in Mexico in Mexican politics and still be part of Mexican politics. It's funny to see also, for example, like all the people who emigrated to like Spain and Paris and London. There's many videos circling in Twitter. This, of course, I don't think those people were very pro AMLO. I mean, those people were complaining that there wasn't enough ballots and something, and they didn't want them to vote. And it's funny how some people were complaining, like during the night of the election, some of the right-wing media were complaining, like, but I don't understand. I heard people like in Paris and London and Madrid and in the business class in the plane, they were all against AMLO. We were gonna win. It's just funny seeing them just whining and crying.
That's fascinating. But then I have to ask this follow-up question, which is how has Univision or Telemundo, the big corporate Spanish-speaking news outlet based in Miami, which covers Latin American news, and yeah, so how have they been covering AMLO? Because I heard that Jorge Ramos yeah, because I heard that Jorge Ramos in that outlet has been covering AMLO in a negative. They've been giving him bad press, so they cover him in a negative way. But I find that quite shocking, given they're very pro illegal aliens. So when illegal immigrants from Mexico and other parts of Latin America come to the United States, they actually are for them just getting citizenship and so forth. So how do you explain that when AMLO, the very policies he advocates, help out the working class and the destitute, poor, so that they don't have to make these very dangerous journeys in order to go to the United States, where most of them are exploited? So I'm curious your response on that.
Yeah, it's Jorge Ramos. It's just so funny. He would, God, I mean, I will never forget his his videos about in Venezuela, filming these totally orchestrated videos about people, rummaging in the garbage, and then he's showing it to Maduro, just like, and you can see that it's totally orchestrated. Jorge Ramos, I think God, he's so funny because you would see Jorge Ramos come to the mañaneras, to the morning briefings. AMLO during this whole presidency would have from Monday to Friday would have a morning conference. He would first have a security conference every day with a security cabinet, and then after that he would have a press conference every day where anybody, including Jorge Ramos, any journalist could come over and ask him questions and be quite upfront about the questions and be quite and really try to contradict AMLO. And it's always funny because he would I think he would do it once a year. I think he kind of like had the thing. He would come over and he would, like go to the mañanera, and AMLO would always give him the voice because he knew, oh, here comes Jorge Ramos, or so I'm gonna, and he would say, Jorge, what do you want to say? And Jorge would come up and say, Mr. President, I'm seeing the numbers of your, like these are official numbers from your website, from the government website. And, he would say something like, there have been increases in murdering, in the numbers of murdered people have increased during the presidency. What do you have to say about this? And every single time, López Obrador would have to take out the graphics and show him how that increase, is actually something which didn't start with the government, started before, AMLO's presidency. Now there was an increase, but this increase wasn't, like something which there wasn't no murders and then AMLO came over and it exponentially shooted up. No, it was like a pattern, like a estimate pattern which was going up, and then how at the end of the presidency that went down, because that's another thing that's another of the gains of AMLO. There's been a 20% decrease in the murder ratings in Mexico. I mean, there's still violence, there's still problems, but there's this, right? So every time Jorge Ramos would come up and he would have to every time explain this, like he was explaining to like like a little kid who didn't understand, some math problem, and he would have to explain it. And it was like, it was this ritual where we'd see Jorge Ramos. It's, this, and then it was not only Jorge Ramos, they would also send people from Telemundo and from other people from Univision, and they would do the same thing. I try to, do hard questions, ask the hard questions in front of the president, and um, and it's so funny to see them just like, having to, sit down and shut up and not say anything else. But,
but that's fascinating. And when Jay, who's a member of the Mexico Solidarity campaign, when I asked him, well, why would Univision and why would Univision and Telemundo and their English versions, why would they be hostile to a socialist reformist like AMLO, who's it's true, he's not as radical as a Hugo Chavez or even an Evo Morales. He is what you would call a center leftist. And if you were to compare him, yeah, you would be able to compare him to a Bernie Sanders or to a Jeremy Corbyn. But he's helping out like the very poor people, those illegal immigrants who can only speak Spanish when they go into the United States. Like his policies are very much helping out like those people. So why do you think Jorge Ramos and that's those kind of journalists or junk journalists, why would they be so hostile to a person like AMLO?
Yeah, I mean, I think this ties to your previous question, which I hadn't like answered totally, when you said this outlet seemed to be pro, immigration or pro diaspora. They seem to render a service to these communities by trying to see, by trying to post like a liberal or a pro immigration agenda. But I mean, this is just a facade. The interests of those media outlets is really just to serve United States interests, and specifically Democratic Party, not Democratic, but the Democrat interests, and and yeah, I mean, if why did I mean this brings us to comparisons. You mentioned Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, of course. In this sense, yeah, I mean, there's not a radicality like the one we found in Chavez and the one we found in Morales. But this is important. Where does, I mean, Chavez, I mean, for me, Chavez is one of my heroes. Chavez is, as this precursor. There is another precursor to Chavez, actually. But, I mean, and this is Jean-Bertrand Aristide, and this is something we forget. What was known as, the progressive governments and the governments of Latin America, what in English is referred to as the pink tide, does not exactly start in America. It starts as always in the Caribbean, just like with the Haitian Revolution. The movement started in the Caribbean. Jean-Bertrand Aristide was a liberation theologian.
Yeah.
He was something coming from liberation theology. And liberation theology, as well as philosophy, as well as the philosophy of liberation, is something which is very much embedded in what the socialism of Chavez and the socialism of Evo Morales is trying to do. And because this is another thing. I mean, it's important to be socialist, but it's not important just to import categories from the West, like always. Oh, this is Marxism. This is how we're going to do. Yeah, how are we going to do it? I mean, are we expecting to have a bourgeoisie like they had in the center, a bourgeoisie that depended on colonialism to create the mass gains that were able to industrialize? If we are the ones who brought about that the possibility of that industrialization of how capitalism worked, but it's a totally different context. So that streak of liberation theology, which is a streak which has which brings an importance to putting the poor first, to serve the poor, to serve the marginalized, to serve those who are most marginalized in society. You know, it's the totally opposite of the trickle down. You know, the trickle down of, you know, you give the private enterprise, you give them money, and that money will, you know, and they will make factories, and they will make jobs, and they will make, you know, businesses, and that money will come down. No, you know what is present in the forms of socialism, of the Latin American forms of socialism coming from Chavez and coming from these movements, is a movement where what is prioritized is helping the most vulnerable sectors of society first. And this is something specifically coming from liberation theology. And this is something which is very clear for Chavez through his readings of Enrique Dussel, who is this Argentinian Mexican philosopher of philosophy of liberation, of his reading of his politics of liberation. And it is something which is also not so markedly mentioned as with Chavez, not so markedly mentioned as socialism, but it's which also present with Andrés Manuel López Obrador. So no, I'm sorry. Just to point, you know, like if we look at this as how this is moving, but we also kind of, you mentioned, you know, Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn is a close friend of López Obrador. They're very close friends. Look, you know, AMLO is different from Bernie Sanders because Bernie Sanders has not left the Democratic Party. He even functions as a form of gathering up the progressive forces that might want to not be part of the Democratic Party, gathering them up and making them believe that within the Democratic Party there can be some sort of move forward more progressively. For Bernie Sanders to be able to be like AMLO, he would have to say, I quit Democratic Party, I'm going to make my own party, and this is going to be my project. But Bernie Sanders is never going to do that. You know, Jeremy Corbyn has decided to go independent, but this is just last year, right?
Yeah, I mean, and of course he's forced to do it. If he wasn't forced to have done it,
yeah. So
Jeremy,
this is the difference.
Unfortunately, would still have that would still have that tactic of join labor and we can reform labor.
Yeah.
But,
so I mean,
but interesting what you were saying about AMLO is that is I think long term, long term, his policies are going to help out the the destitute poor, those who are unemployed. But at the moment, he's focusing on how we have this awful thing called NAFTA. The U.S. economy and even the Canadian economy is very integrated in the Mexican economy. How can I help out those who are working class, but they're poor, the working poor? And by trying to force, all of those companies to basically stop using Mexican labor as cheap labor, but actually pay them what they're owed, that, of course, lifts a lot of people out of poverty overnight, and of course, we hope will help out with social, mobility. And Mexico already has, very tiny though, has a middle class that they can, that AMLO can sort of use to sort of help with that social mobility. Whereas in places like, Bolivia, where the majority of the people, the indigenous people, basically lived under an apartheid regime, and then of course with Venezuela, there's it has its own unique situation of the very very wealthy and just and a very very tiny middle class, but mostly struggling, working poor, destitute poor, so, which and of course which means that when AMLO is pushing his policies, he has to be very he's a chess player, as John Ackerman says, so he has to be very careful in how he rolls out his reforms and champions the forgotten people, right?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, yes, definitely. I mean, I think this brings us to a point which I was telling you about, with my recent rereading of Lenin, and it has to do, exactly, of understanding how we how do we apply categories, and how do we apply, like philosophical political categories to our understanding of political struggle, of, application of theory and practice. And I would like to tie this into this ideas about, oh, AMLO is not socialist, AMLO is just, and, the word usually thrown around is social democrat. And this word gets a lot thrown around, oh, he's just a social democrat.
Yeah.
Um, so, I mean, we have to understand these ideas between, strategy, tactic, these ideas uh, between, you know, concrete realities and uh, abstract forms of trying to analyze, the use of abstractions to try to analyze concrete realities. Um, yes, if we, for example, look at what some of the critiques are saying, or, and the critiques going back to that critique from the Trotskyists, like he's not really doing, great things. It's just, like he's just even stooping to US imperialism. Uh, and he's just a social democrat, he's thinking about the social democrat. The first thing, I mean, we have to understand is that we cannot just simply use Anglo-European or Western categories of thought and apply them willy-nilly to other historical contexts of the global
Yeah.
South. And especially with this category social democrat, and I must admit, I mean, I must, confess that I've used it in the past unknowingly, and now I understand better. You know, if we talk about social democrats and think about, reformists in the Weimar Republic, I mean, this has nothing to do with what's going on in what we could consider as national liberation, nationalist governments in the global South, and how they have had to function, and how, as you say, they have had to strategize and have to make tactics to navigate with the ever looming threat of intervention, whether it's economic or military or political interference. And you have to, like Lenin, I think it's very interesting. Lenin mentions, we have to differentiate between your desires and your actual realities. He's talking about, like when the Bolsheviks or when communists have to engage in parliaments, the infantile leftism, and there's lots of that saying, oh no, Lopez Obrador should have just, like if he was a real, if he was a real radical, he would just, get rid of NAFTA, and he would get rid of, like, and close the border and tell the United States to fuck off.
And
And
I used
yeah,
to be
yeah, yeah.
guilty of that, and
No,
I used
no,
to be guilty of that. So
no, I mean, it's a desire. I mean, like Lenin explicitly says it, we desire to destroy parliamentary representation because it's a bourgeois representation. It's a bourgeois form of representation. Parliamentary representation only represents the interests of the social relations which hold the economic formations. And it's a desire. It's a desire to find better forms of representation. But the thing is, like, we have to look at the concrete terms of where we are. Mexico could not really have had, at this point in time, a communist revolution or a socialist revolution or something like that. This could not have happened. And what we could have had is what we had: a nationalist liberation movement. A nationalist, not in the sense of what nationalism is in the West, but nationalism in the sense without an exceptionalism, which is what's present in the global South. And this is what we had: the situation where Mexico has a frontier with the United States and Canada. I mean, unfortunately, we're stuck with Dumb and Dumber. Nothing we could do about this. And the United States is our primary commercial partner in Mexico. Now Mexico's is the first, yes, first commercial partner. Before it was Canada and China, but now it's Mexico. You have to deal. I mean, you have to maneuver with what you have consciously. And speaking of the of the people's conscious, I mean, if you told people right now, let's have a communist revolution after all what we've been through of the Cold War and all the scares and everything, people would say, no, you're crazy, would never want to do that. But if you tell them, no, let's put the poor first. Let's give people social programs, which Lopez Obrador has done extremely well. You know, incentivize social programs. Which what is social programs? It's just giving, you know, the congealed labor, you know, like the worth of created by labor back to the people who labored for that worth, for that value. And this is what has happened. This is what was able to happen. Will there be forms, more progressive forms in the future? Yes, I believe so, because being, you know, talking to people, you know, the Morena people, the cadres, the people who are doing, you know, who are walking the streets, the people who are, you know, organizing in the barrios, who are organizing neighborhoods, I see that there's a yearning for something more, and there's a yearning towards an understanding that there's a point where the superstructure, what you change within the superstructure, has to get to the point where you change what is at the base. And this is going to happen at some point, hopefully. I mean, I cannot predict the future, but I see people changing in that form. But yeah, I mean, this is what we have. AMLO is not a social democrat. AMLO is a politician that has had to learn a lot how to maneuver concretely with what we have right now and what we can do and what cannot do now, and to function in that way politically.
My second to last question. So it's obvious that that AMLO's legacy is very that AMLO's legacy is one of a very positive legacy. Hence why, you know, his successor won the election. Before we talk about her, that, you know, that'll be my last question. I have to ask though this question, and this will be my, you know, my left criticism of AMLO, which is, why hasn't AMLO taken Mexico out of NAFTA or ended the drug war and approach drug abuse as a mental health, public health matter, and just legalize, you know, the drug trade and adopt the either the Uruguayan model or the Dutch model or the Portuguese model, because that would overnight be a huge blow to American and Canadian imperialism. What's your response? Why AMLO hasn't done that, or even why haven't the people power movements that champion AMLO? Why haven't they championed this and made this more of a bigger issue?
Yes. Well, this is a problem which exceeds Mexico, because this is a problem which is not only about Mexico. This is a problem about the fact that we are next to the United States, which is, you know, a country that consumes drugs. And it's funny because there's always this idea that it's kind of a strange idea that, you know, like these brown people, you know, they transport the drug to the frontier, and all of a sudden, you know, like magically in the frontier, the drug just sort of like, you know, starts, you know, like moving in the United States by itself, by osmosis almost, you know, by itself towards the consumer. You know, there's never a talk about how the networks within the United States, the networks of drug trafficking within the United States, are imbued within the very structures, probably the economic and political structures of the United States. This is a problem which Mexico by itself will not be able to solve unless it is solved in a much more hemispheric form or in a much more global form. And there's something which has kind of radically changed the way we understand the problem of drug trafficking and drug consumption. Something that has radically changed this is the fact that now we have to deal with fentanyl. This has changed in many ways how we can deal with this. What has fentanyl shown us? If we look from a Marxist perspective to the drug problem, we have to understand that what creates the gains, what creates the surplus value in drugs is the fact that they are illegal, right? So this was kind of like the basis for legalizing drugs, was the fact that you know, surplus value in drugs, you know, what the money that comes out of the drugs that makes them you know, so profitable was the fact that they are illegal. Since they are illegal, there's, you know, this requires a lot of labor to be able to illegally produce them and distribute them. And this creates, like the incentive for people to get into the drug business, right? So the logical answer to this would be to legalize drugs. If drugs are legalized, then the surplus value of drugs would no longer be there, and this wouldn't be such a profitable business.
Would be a huge
This,
blow to organized crime.
yes, and this speed, right? Now, again, we have to understand that the context of Holland and the context of Portugal is very different from the fact that in Mexico, drug trafficking is not only profitable for cartels, but it's profitable for a lot of sectors within the United States. And what fentanyl shows us is that we, just by legalizing, just by saying, okay, we legalize drugs, we cut the incentivization, this problem will end. This is not necessarily true if we consider fentanyl, which is such a extremely dangerous drug. What will probably happen is that the very market structures, the very global market of drug consumption, will start creating drugs which are more potent, which are more lethal, and which you cannot just simply legalize. Can you legalize fentanyl? Would legalizing fentanyl be a good idea? I mean, I'm asking as a question because, I mean,
where you're coming from, and I certainly, and I think, I mean, when it comes to something like like heroin, I mean, the best one can do is provide a safe place that people can exchange clean needles and so forth like that, while still working to wean them off of uh, off of the drug. But of course, I wouldn't want something like crystal meth to be
yeah,
to be yeah, wouldn't want something like crystal
no,
meth to be legal, or even crack cocaine. Like, no, that would be like disastrous. But if, of course, if the government, uh, if it was legalized, the government would more or less, I would hope, take those off of like the market, and pay
yeah,
certain farmers and whatnot to
yeah, no,
not
I mean,
produce certain lethal drugs.
yes, no, I mean, and still, for example, we talk about meth and we talk about heroin. I mean, this is nothing about to fentanyl, to what fentanyl is and how it functions, and how fentanyl is lacing other drugs. And this is one of the problems. Now, if people were to consume cannabis, they don't know if it's laced with fentanyl in many aspects. This is what something was happening. I mean, I agree. For example, in the case of cannabis, there was some improvement in regards to constitutionally. Now it is. I mean, there's no legal basis for you to be arrested for carrying cannabis. This was something passed by the Supreme Court, but the fact that the only problem is that the judicial branch did not take this on as something which needed to be then, laws need to be made for this to work in practice, right? And for example, in this case, I think that there should be a legalization in the sense that it would be good of cannabis at least, because that would create, I mean, that would help people who are right now in prison because of cannabis possession to leave. It would help those people who are there for something which is really ridiculous, right? So in that sense, I think yes. I mean, this is also one of my critiques. This should have been done, but you also have to understand something. There's a lot of pressure. I mean, we're already pressed by the United States, but there's a lot of pressure for the United States for not to do this. This is how hypocritical it is. Some states in the United States have legalized, but I don't think they'd be too happy about Mexico legalizing cannabis. And this would be another battle added to the so many battles that we already have to deal with, in Mexico with the United States and with everything, right?
Drug wars. So the drug war, it's too profitable for the United States,
It's kind of
because
it's
because the drug war was not. Wasn't even created out of noble. I'm sure some people believe that like a drug war is very noble, but it wasn't created for noble reasons. It was created for very ignoble reasons,
yeah,
like,
yeah, definitely,
well,
yeah.
basically keeping the Black, the Latinx, and the indigenous population in line,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
using it as a carte blanche to meddle into Mexican affairs and Latin American affairs, because the CIA, they're the ones that prop up rival cartels whenever it suits whatever is their imperial purpose.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, for example, something. I mean, and if we can see, yeah, I mean, without going into how the United States used drug money to finance the wars in Central America, or how they used it to finance the wars in Southeast Asia, and all this, just by looking at um, how how profitable it is for sectors which are not really talking about it, and how um, just to have a drug war, and just how the DEA as an agency had such interference in Mexican affairs for such a long time, and how profitable it was for them to tell people that that as an agency they were necessary to battle the drug war, and to fight against drug trafficking, and how, for example, AMLO has had to there was this big problem, which has even led to the fact that the DEA has used smear tactics against AMLO during the campaign by pushing forth a series of articles and saying that López Obrador had colluded with the drug traffickers, with the narcos, and they made this big unfounded narrative through ProPublica with Tim Golden, and through Deutsche Welle with Ana Hernandez, to create this narrative that AMLO was colluded with the drug traffickers. It didn't work. It actually kind of backfired, because Obrador now has 80% approval rating. So this narratives didn't really work at all. But if you see how these agencies, especially the DEA, have functioned within Mexico, and how AMLO did not allow them. AMLO asked the DA to register its agents, because before that, they did whatever they want. They people came in, people came out, but AMLO did that, and they were very angry because of that. So I mean, within what has happened, there has been some things which have shown certain confrontation with the forms of the United States, how the United States does things, and how Mexico is now trying to do things. And one of them has to do with the DEA, and how the DEA has functioned not only as a supposed to be, like some sort of um, form of fighting drug trafficking, but as a form of incentivizing it for its own, for its own existence. With the DEA, you need the DEA as long as there is drug trafficking, because you think you have this agency that is fighting that, but in reality, recently I think the director of the DEA was summoned because of corruption, right?
Yeah.
She was, yes, all that thing, and we have had to deal with it. Of course, there's lots still to do with that aspect, and it's something which was going to be an ongoing social and political
Well, I know.
program
Well, I know
problem.
Jay.
Sorry.
I know Jay said that. I mean, he said that even if AMLO and the movement behind him wanted, drugs to be not just decriminalized but legalized in a responsible way, it won't happen. Not under how the United States currently is. So it is so the anti-drug war movement, people in the U.S. and Canada have to step up their game, when it comes to that. My final question is this, which is, what do we have to look forward to with AMLO's successor, Claudia Scheinbaum? I hope I'm not butchering her name. Will it be more of a golden age, or a silver age, or a bronze age for much needed socialist reforms and political revolutions in Mexico? So yeah, what are you hoping we can expect with Claudia Scheinbaum?
Yeah. Yeah, it's so funny. It's been a really strange week. I mean, just from the election last Sunday up to now. I mean, for starters, just having to swim against the current of, right-winger tears, and just like looking at them whining and crying in Twitter, and everybody, just laughing at their antics. But it's funny to me seeing how the United States, especially the media in the United States is, and you know the commentocracy, you know, like the pundits are having like such difficulty in understanding what Claudia is about. And there's all this conspiracy theories. It's really strange. You know, I was listening to Judge Napolitano yesterday with Colonel Wilkerson,
Yes,
and
yes.
Judge Napolitano asked Colonel Wilkerson, "Is Claudia Scheinbaum, is she a CIA asset?" And Wilkerson says, "I thought she was a Mossad asset." You know, so you have this, and then you know, like Saheli has she
Colonel
has said.
Wilkerson said that about Claudia
Yeah, I
Steinbaum.
think he said it sort of like in a joking sort of way because he said something like you never know with Zionist. But you know, like it's funny because I've heard this kind of both rumors. Once is that she's a total Zionist, another one's that like no, she's. I mean, even here in Mexico, before we had this rumor that she was part of Soros's, you know, like open society, and you know, to be honest, I don't know. You know, to be honest, I cannot predict the future. You know, will she do a Lenin Moreno? Nobody knows. The thing is, what I can tell you is, I mean, we could stick to what's happened. You know, I mean, Claudia Sheinbaum didn't come out of the blue. Claudia Sheinbaum was the governor of Mexico City. She was for the since 2018 until she resigned to go into the campaign. She had been governor of Mexico City. Claudia Scheinbaum, this is another thing I heard. Ben Norton, who's really good. I mean, Ben Norton was mentioned that Claudia Scheinbaum came from a like a working class upbringing, or she was like from a humble upbringing, which I mean, I don't know. Maybe he was talking about her grandparents. I mean, she's the daughter of, I mean, she's the granddaughter of immigrants, you know, immigrants from the Holocaust and immigrants before that. And I don't know if she's referring to that, but Claudia Scheinbaum, I mean, this is something which Kurt Hartbach mentioned. I think is very interesting. AMLO was an outsider. AMLO came from Tabasco, which is in the southeast of Mexico, the tropical areas of Mexico. He came from a humble upbringing. AMLO was an outsider, and he was always criticized by the you know the upper middle class and the upper classes as being someone who was, I mean, uh, AMLO hardly finished his degree in political science at UNAM, but he just has an undergrad degree, but because he was, you know, already involved in political movements and in activism, uh, and you know, AMLO was an outsider. But I think it's interesting, Kurt Hackbach mentioned, you know, but Claudia is an insider, and it's going to be interesting to see how they react to an insider. Claudia, you know, Claudia comes from a family of scientists. You know, Annie Pardo, Claudia's mother, she just last year won the National Scientific Prize. She has been a teacher at the Faculty of Science at UNAM for since my parents were studying there, since my parents studied biology there.
And I believe she even studied physics. Physics was one of the things she.
Claudia studied her undergraduate degree in physics, and I'm not sure, I think her master's too. And then she studied her PhD in engineering. She's actually the first woman in Mexico at my university. Well, she's the first woman in my university to have acquired a PhD in engineering. Because you know, usually the engineers here are supposed to be like a male thing, as a man, as you know, as a man's profession. And then Claudia is the first one to have gained that. Claudia was also part of the team that won the Nobel Prize when Molina, which is a chemist who's a Mexican chemist who won the Nobel Prize, and she was part of that team that won the Nobel Prize. So Claudia is not an outsider. Claudia is from the inside. You know, Claudia belongs to. Claudia has functioned until now. I mean, because she's been part of student movements all the way from the 80s. She functioned as a sort of a class traitor to those classes which had certain, you know, to the, if we could call it like a petit bourgeoisie, or you know, the academics and the universities surroundings.
Those who side
Claudia,
off with the upper class, with the reactionary plutocracy.
yeah, exactly, yeah. So I mean, Claudia is extremely well prepared. Claudia has an academic formation, and as a governor of Mexico, someone who lives in Mexico City, I was very much surprised when she came into power at how technified everything became. I mean, I'm someone who uses the metro and who uses buses. I'll talk to you from my direct experience. Mobility in Mexico City improved considerably when she came into power. It was just crazy. how much mobility changed, how much infrastructure changed. It was funny, like if you would go somewhere and then not like a certain part of Mexico City and then not go to that place for some time and then go back there, then you would see that they had, created a bridge to liberate traffic, or they had, expanded the sidewalks, or they had put like a, even like like a sidewalk light for people to be able to cross, or something like this. I mean, there was, I mean, Claudia is someone who improved the city, the mobility, the ways in which the city functioned in a very good manner. I mean, Claudia created this system where you can now online do all of your, get your driver's license, pay your taxes, pay your water. All of these kind of things now can be done digitally. Claudia is someone, as a scientist, I guess, is someone very technical and has like very technical people. She had very technical people, technically, savvy people working with her. So that's, I mean, that's something very concrete that we have about Claudia. She functioned very well as someone who who can do things when it comes to this very, very basic things. Social programs. Also, Mexico has like, I mean, this social program thing, kind of has been instituted in the whole country, but Mexico City has had very good progressive and very radical social programs. This is something which also Claudia did. There is one thing which just happened this week, which is kind of funny and made me understand one thing, value López Obrador, and also understand that maybe Claudia is still kind of green when it comes to, she's very good at the administrative part, probably better than AMLO. And AMLO always says it. She's better than me at, I mean, administrative wise. I think Claudia is probably better than AMLO, and AMLO knows it. And he always says she knows, she's smarter than me. She knows more than me. But there's the political acuteness, the political shrewdness, the political savvy, the experience. I think AMLO still has like the upper hand there. This week, after the election, the day after the election, the price of the dollar went up. That's another thing that AMLO did. The dollar price, the peso to the dollar lowered. The price, the dollar became cheaper. And this is something we hadn't experienced, I mean, forever, all my lifetime. And seeing the peso the dollar go down and the peso go up. I mean, the peso is now, like during this last year, it was one of the strongest currencies in the world. I mean, how much worth it had gained. But on Monday, the price of the dollar went up all of a sudden. And there was fear that, what was going on, what was happening. And this is something normal, I guess. The markets were kind of uncertain about what had happened and didn't, and this sort of happened. So Claudia immediately issued a statement saying that she was planning on keeping the same finance minister that AMLO has right now, Ramirez de la O, who's very good. She's an excellent finance minister. He's really top notch. That guy is, like, he's on top of his game. He's really good. And so Claudia did this, saying like, if I do this, maybe, the markets will kind of stabilize. And Ramirez de la O gave a kind of like a small, he gave an announcement saying that he would continue and he mentioned what his measures would be, the same things as, macroeconomic, control, fiscal, having, good, sound fiscal procedures and blah, 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 and all of this. And sort of that kind of stabilized things. But then there started being talk about the things that need to be done between, AMLO leaving office and Claudia coming in, and how things need to be sped up, especially because Claudia not only won by a landslide, but also the legislative branch, won by a landslide. AMLO only had like a simple majority, but now Claudia has the simple majority plus a 2/3 majority. So this was something which we knew as voters, as people, like we knew that this was important, not only to vote for Claudia, but to vote for the senators and the House of Representatives, because what is now needed, I mean, through this, is to do amendments to the Constitution to be able to take things further. And one of those things is that by having the executive branch and the legislative branch now under Morena, now what needs to be done is to clean out the judicial branch, which is the bastion of the conservatives as in most countries. That's the bastion of conservatism in Mexico. And
Yeah,
that's the bastion of corruption, and that's the bastion of lawfare. That's where lawfare takes place.
exactly.
So now that we have this is what's the next, is what we'll call here the plan C, because AMLO already did plan A and plan B, and those didn't work. So now there's a plan C, was to have the election, have people voting two-third majority, and through the two-third majority, now make amendments to democratize the judicial branch by having elections, by having elections for magistrates and for judges. So this is the next step, modifying the constitution so that now there will be elections for magistrates and judges. So when they started talking about this, the dollar went up again, and prices, the market started destabilizing again. And I think Claudia was kind of scared, actually. I think there was kind of like a little apprehension in Claudia and in her people that they didn't know what was happening, what was going on. It wasn't until AMLO yesterday, I think, no, on Thursday or yesterday, I'm not sure. I think yesterday in a press conference said, no, calm down. You know why this is happening? Because the judicial branch right now is at the service of the banks. It's at the service of those people who are scared that if this happens, their interests, the people that serve them, the judges, the magistrates, the courts that serve, the private sector, are going to lose that interference that they have there, and this is driving the problems with the government, with the economy, this is what's driving the dollar up.
Yeah.
So when AMLO said this, and he said, this is normal, this is going to happen, we're going to have to, wear it out, and we're going to have to tell, we're going to have to talk to people and tell people that, no, things are going to be good for everybody, don't worry in this. When that happens, sort of things calmed down. But, you could see there that, this is where you can see the chess player, in action, as Ackerman was saying, this is someone who has a lot of political savvy, not only from the fact that he has political experience, but from the fact that he has, he studied political science. He did his undergrad degree in political science. So this is someone who knows politics very well. And maybe there's, a learning curve there that Claudia might have to take before being able to, to really, get things going like AMLO did in those aspects. In other aspects, I think Claudia.
I think as both of us said, here's hoping she's not going to be a traitor like Lenin Moreno. Here's hoping that she does continue on with the good policies of AMLO, but even punches above her belt. And but of course, that takes a committed, dedicated people powers movement, which I'm sure, which Mexico definitely has. And here's hoping the Mexico Solidarity Campaign tells the Western leftists to, like, guys, help Mexico. Don't decry Mexico when they have a leftist in power. Alrighty, well, I think that's a perfect place to end, and we're gonna have to get you back on the program, to see how her first 100 days are
yeah, sure.
Yes. And then in the future, maybe we can hopefully we can get Eric Lunza of the World Socialist Website to debate about AMLO's legacy. But
yeah,
until
we didn't really touch upon that, but yeah, okay.
Actually, let's do the questionnaire very quickly. Before we end the show, we usually end the show for doing the questionnaire that was done by Marcel Proust, later popular and sadly recently departed French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, later my hero, the great James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. Gabriel, let's do it again. What is your favorite word?
Well, I think this is the second time I do it, and you always get me off guard. My favorite word. This is strange. I mean, I can.
And it could be in Spanish.
Yeah, I guess like actually, what word I like, which is kind of funny. I was thinking about the other day, gingembre, which is actually a French word, which is ginger. I don't know why I like that word.
Oh,
in Spanish is
French is a very nice word. So.
But I don't know. There's something about it, gingembre. But you know,
Then,
like jengibre sounds a little more harsh, but gingembre sounds okay. But I don't
then,
know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. But
what is your least favorite words?
no, pardon. My least favorite
What?
words.
Yeah, what's your least favorite words?
Oh God. Getting up in the morning. I guess I don't like. I don't like the semantics of that word.
Some waking up.
Yeah, wake up.
Then,
Yeah.
what turns you on creatively, spiritually, emotionally, or psychologically?
I'm sorry. What I?
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, emotionally, or psychologically?
Oh my God. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, dealing with theories, dealing with philosophy and dealing with theoretical thought. I mean, that's always something I really like.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then what turns you off?
Oh God, what turns me on? Off. I'm sorry.
Off. Yeah, off.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, sometimes deadlines, having to deal with deadlines. When I have a deadline, I don't work well with deadlines,
Yeah.
especially writing. I mean, I'm writing. I'm very slow at writing, and having to write with deadlines. Now that I'm doing my thesis, that's yeah, that's
Exactly.
really yeah.
What was your favorite curse word? And it could be in any language.
Oh God, favorite curse word. Well, I guess like as a Mexican, the one I use, and I think this was my answer from the previous one. The one I use most as a Mexican is chinga la madre, and I guess that's
God
like as a
imagine.
Mexican, yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
Then what sound or noise do you love, followed by what sound or noise do you dislike?
What? I'm sorry. What
What sound or noise do you love, followed by what sound or noise do you dislike?
noise?
Yeah,
What?
what
Oh,
sound?
oh.
Yeah. What sound or noise do you like, and then what sound or noise do you dislike?
Uh, well, I guess as I like the sound of the sea, which I guess is a little cliche, but I haven't been to the coast for a long time, so
Yeah.
I've been thinking about that a lot. And just like last time, I really dislike refrigerator buzz. I don't like it. There's something about it which is just bothering.
And then, what profession? Yeah. What profession, if you weren't doing yours, would you love to do? Although technically, you're not in a profession yet. I mean, you're
Yeah, no, no.
still in academia. So
Yeah, well, the funny thing is right now, I'm really having second thoughts about academia because I mean, I look at my supervisors and my teachers and God bless them, but I see that, like how difficult life sometimes is for them and how they're having, like how difficult it is to get tenure and how difficult it is all that thing is difficult. And I'm really having second thoughts about this one, like yeah, like having to
okay,
give
so if you
classes and
don't
having
go,
to correct
so if you
papers.
don't go into academia, okay, so if you don't go into academia, what would be your ideal profession if you could do it?
Oh my God, I haven't, I like the research part. I like that. I like doing research. Maybe just a thing where I didn't have to, like give classes or have to, like correct papers or have to, like do all the, trying to get grants and all that. Just the research part. That's what
Okay,
I like.
but then what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Um, God. Uh,
Working for Vicente Fox, working for Jorge
yeah, probably,
Ramos.
having to work for what I know a lot of people who had to do that, right? Work for a right-wing administration, knowing that, I mean, imagine how horrible it must be, like if you're like left wing and you're working in an administration just because you need your job and you need it, but you
Exactly.
that must be
Exactly.
like
I've often joked to people that I would only do a journalism job for. I mean, I hate most of the corporate media and Western state media, but I would only take a job like that if I had a kid that I needed to support and I want to, I want to
yeah,
spoil the little guy and have them go to Harvard or whatever overpriced
yeah.
university. But yeah.
Yeah, and to think that there's lots of people doing that right now in the world, right?
Well, if and then finally, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is your vision of the afterlife? And even if you're an atheist, please still answer the question.
Um, yeah, I'm going to give the same answer I gave last time. I would like to hear all is forgiven, all is forgotten.
And it will
Thank
be.
you.
Well, we were joined on we were joined on this edition of One Plus One, all things Latin America, all things Mexico, with Gabriel Martinez from Mexico, who has lived most of his life in Mexico City. He holds an MA in critical and cultural theory. from the University of Leeds, England, and is currently almost done, hopefully, studying a PhD in Latin American Studies at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. And before starting his PhD, he was a collaborator at Orinoco Tribune. Thank you so much, Gabriel, for taking the
Thank
time,
you.
especially on Saturday morning, to join us. And I wish you the best of luck in your studies and all you do. And
Thank you. No, thank you. My pleasure. And I'm sorry. I feel that I blabbered on and didn't really say anything. I mean, I feel like I said too much and didn't say anything, but
oh
thank you
no,
so
no,
much for
no,
the
no,
invitation.
don't worry. And no, don't worry. It was all good. And folks, let's also not forget that it is Pride Month, so solidarity, especially so solidarity to the 2S LGBTQIA community, and solidarity forever. Power to the people and death to heteronormativity, and of course, a special solidarity to the T, the B, and the I, and the A. It's because all of y'all are particularly under attack. So, and to straight leftists, even if you don't get it, just don't be an asshole. And long live Frida Kahlo,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Here,
who
here.
was a bisexual
Yeah, and a
communist,
Marxist
so
and a Leninist.
a true pinko in every sense of the word, right?
Very Leninist, yes.
So until then, power to the people, and I hope all goes well with Mexico, and we will have
Thank you so
Gabriel
much.
back on to cover her first 100 days.
Thank you, Yuri. Thank you so much.
Likewise.